The wind carried the stench of sweat and hot iron across the yard as the crowd pressed in tight around the branding post, boots grinding dust into splinters where the bride stood bound, her wedding veil torn and streaked with grit, wrists lashed raw against the scarred timber while men hooted for justice that stank of whiskey and spite, and the sheriff's grin cut the glare like a knife as he barked that this was what came of traitor blood. A bride who led her groom into an outlaw ambush and watched him die with a smile, and though her throat ached to scream the truth, that she'd fought, that she'd begged, that his blood still burned her hands, she bit down hard and tasted copper because begging never bought mercy in a place where law was just another word for power, and the jeers thickened as the smith hauled the iron from the coals, its tip glowing hell red. Spitting sparks that hissed when they kissed the dirt, and the heat hit her face like a furnace door yawning open, making her eyes blur so the world swam red and gold, and somewhere a dog barked wild before a boot silenced it with a thud, and the sheriff raised his hand to hush the mob, his badge winking like a serpent's eye as he drawled that no man owned a woman who broke her vows, so the brand would bind her to the law instead, and laughter ripped the wind like barbed wire. But through the blur of heat, she saw it. A shape swelling from the timberline beyond the corral, tall as a tree, broad as the mountain's own shadow. A man in a coat, black with trail dust and a beard coarse as frost-burnt pine. His shoulders hung with a wolf-pelt cloak that flickered silver in the fire glow as he moved, slow and certain, parting the crowd like smoke parting for wind. And silence cracked across the yard as he stepped into the spit of light, his eyes flat and dark as riverstone, locking on the sheriff with a weight that made the man's grin hitch, and his voice rolled low, deep as thunder crawling over peaks, saying words that dropped like iron into the hush. Put the iron on me, and for a breath no one moved, the smith's hands freezing on the tongs while the heat shimmered thick as a mirage, and the sheriff barked a laugh sharp as breaking bone, spitting that no man brands for another's sin unless he's married her in his bed. And the mountain man's jaw worked slow, his teeth flashing white under the dusk of his beard as he stepped closer, his shadow swallowing the firelight whole, and he said soft enough to make every spine quake that vows ain't words. They're blood. And if the law wants blood, it can drink his before it touches her skin. And the iron hissed louder in the hush, like it knew which flesh it would kiss, and the hawk wheeled above, screaming once into the hard blue like some wild judge come to witness the fire that was about to crown the guilty and the damned alike. The sheriff's laugh cracked like a whip through the frozen hush, bouncing hard off the corral rails as he swaggered closer with the firelight, crawling red over his badge, his grin cut wide and mean as a saw as he told the mountain man that brave words don't weigh much against iron, that flesh screams the same no matter whose skin it bites, and the crowd roared approval, a ring of boots grinding grit as they closed in tight, their faces shining with the fever that comes when men smell blood about to boil, and the smith lifted the tongs again, the brand spitting sparks like a live serpent, heat shimmering in waves that bent the world until it felt like hell had bubbled up through the dust, and the bride strained against her ropes till the fibers chewed blood from her wrists, her breath a ragged saw in her throat as she choked out that he should go, that they'd kill him for this. But the mountain man didn't so much as glance her way, his eyes locked on the sheriff like iron rivets, voice rolling low and steady as thunder rolling down a gorge, saying the law's line ain't worth spit if it's drawn in a woman's flesh, and if a mark needs burning, burn it deep where it'll make the world think twice. And the sheriff's grin sharpened as he stepped close enough for his breath to smell of rotgut and rust, saying, "Fine then, big man, let's carve that mark in meat thick enough to scream proper, but a trade needs balance. So here's the bargain. Take the brand and the rope after, swing high where the crows can clean your bones, and maybe the girl walks, and the words slithered through the heat like snakes slick with oil, and the crowd howled savage because cruelty makes men drunk, their voices rolling like a black river as they stomped for the deal. And the mountain man just stood, broad as the timberline, his jaw working slow under the dusk of his beard till he spit in the dust, the sound sharp as a shot, and said one word that hit like a hammer, "Done," and the fire hissed louder like it knew blood was coming, its glow painting the brand's edge a hungry red, while the smith's hands shook with the weight of it, and the sheriff stepped back grinning wide as the sky split with a hawk's cry so fierce it made every head twitch up, the bird wheeling high over the smoke like some wild judge circling a gallows, and the mountain man dragged his coat off slow, shoulders rippling with the raw weight of a life lived where mercy dies in the teeth of storms, and as the iron hissed and the ropes fell slack from the bride's wrists, her knees buckled because she knew the fire wasn't just heat, it was the fuse. And once it kissed his flesh, the whole yard would burn in ways no wind could blow out. The yard held its breath as the iron hissed red in the smith's quaking tongs, its glow spitting sparks that danced like devils across the dirt, while the crowd pressed close enough to taste the heat rolling off it, their faces shiny with sweat and fever as boots scraped in a restless circle, and the bride stood clutching her shredded skirts, her wrists raw and bleeding where the ropes had bitten deep, her throat locked on a sob that clawed like barbed wire as she watched the mountain man strip his shirt slow, the fire painting the scars crisscrossing his back in streaks of molten copper, each mark a story carved in blood and frost, and when he turned the raw power in his shoulders, stole the words from every mouth, because he looked less like a man than a piece of earth ripped from the peaks, solid and black and breathing smoke, and the sheriff grinned wider, teeth gleaming like a wolf's in the fire glow as he barked for the smith to brand him deep, to make the mark scream proper, and the iron sang a high, thin note as it kissed the wind, the heat shuddering through the yard like a fever before the tongs jerked down hard, slamming the flesh of his chest with a hiss that sounded like sin frying off bone, and the stink of burning meat rolled thick as tar as the brand carved its crooked halo into muscle, the smoke writhing upward like a black prayer while the crowd howled for blood. But the mountain man didn't scream, didn't grunt, didn't twitch, only locked his jaw till the cords stood like braided rope, and his eyes burned flat and endless as the peaks, and that silence struck sharper than any cry, cutting through the mob's roar until the laughter died in their throats, and something cold slithered down every spine. Because a man who could swallow fire without a sound was a man who'd burn the world before he broke, and the sheriff felt it too. Felt it in the quiver under his ribs as his grin flickered like a candle in wind. But pride's a beast that don't back down easy, so he shoved hard at the hush, snarling that if one brand don't break him, maybe two will. Maybe the law should write its gospel all across his hide. And the bride's cry split sharp and raw, her hands clawing at the dust as she begged through a throat-gone blood that they'd done enough, that he'd paid 10 times what any man owed. But the sheriff's boots thudded heavy as he stepped close, his fingers flicking the revolver on his hip like a snake's tongue tasting death. And in the glow of the coals the hawk screamed high, wheeling a black arc over the rim, its cry shredding the dusk as the mountain man's lips curled slow. The first ghost of a grin dragging across his beard, and his voice rolled out low and flat as a gravestone when he said, 6 brands, 6 bullets, 6 nails in a box. Pick your count, lawman, 'cause you'll need 'em all before I'm done. And the words hit like a rifle crack in a church, splintering the silence, and the sheriff's grin rotted into something mean and shaking as the fire spat sparks that smelled like blood and hell and the first taste of war simmering low in the bones of the yard. The fire spat sparks that curled like angry tongues into the dark as the sheriff leaned close, his badge glowing like a demon's eye in the heat haze, and his grin was a blade when he drawled that a brand wasn't enough to break a man carved from stone, so let's sweeten the pot. One more mark for her freedom, 2 more, and the rope stays coiled. 3, and maybe he walks before the sun boils this yard dry, and the crowd howled savage, boots stomping a dust storm that glittered like powdered rust in the firelight, their voices thick with the fever of cruelty that tastes like whiskey on the tongue. And the mountain man didn't blink, didn't twitch, just stood with his chest raw and smoking where the iron had chewed its sermon into his flesh, his breath rolling slow and even like wind dragging over pines, and the bride staggered forward. Clutching his arm with fingers slick from her own torn wrists, begging through a throat gone blood that he let it end. That pride wasn't worth a pyre. But his eyes dropped to hers, dark as a storm cell splitting a peak, and something in that look struck deep as a spike, quiet and fierce, a vow hammered in silence. And he turned slow to the sheriff, his jaw working like millstone as he rasped low enough to rattle bone. Heat it, and the smith's hands shook when he plunged the brand back into the coals, sparks leaping like fireflies dragged from hell, and the hawk screamed overhead, its shadow slicing the torch glow like a blade swung from heaven, while the mob pressed in tight, their faces masks of red hunger, and the sheriff's voice cracked loud as gunfire when he ordered the post cleared because the next mark carves on his back. And the bride's sob tore sharp as a bullet as they spun her aside and dragged him forward, his boots grinding grit that stank of blood and ash as he gripped the post like a crucifix and squared those shoulders broad as the timberline. And when the iron came up hissing like a rattler, every throat in the yard cinched tight because men crave the scream. They drink it like prayer. And when the tongs slammed down with a sizzle that ripped steam skyward, silence shattered. Not with a cry, but with the sound of teeth grinding like stone on steel, his jaw locked hard as canyon rock while smoke boiled off his hide and the stink of charred flesh rolled thick enough to gag a wolf. And that silence burned hotter than the brand, searing every jeer to ash until even the sheriff's grin cracked under the weight of it, flickering like a lamp in wind as the big man twisted loose from the post. His breath a furnace, his fists curling slow as thunderheads, and his voice came rough as gravel sliding into a grave when he told the lawman the count just changed, that the only brand he'd wear now was the sheriff's name carved clean through his hide, and the words dropped heavy into the hush like a coffin lid slamming shut. And somewhere out on the timberline a wolf howled low and long, and every man in that yard felt the ground tilt like the world was fixing to spill blood in rivers before the moon climbed high. The shot cracked like a bone snapping under a boot, sharp and mean, and for a split breath the world froze, torches licking orange tongues into the smoke, men's eyes wide and white as peeled eggs, before chaos boiled over, the yard erupting like a nest of hornets kicked hard, rifles barking flame as powder smoke rolled thick and bitter, and the crowd scattered in a roar of boots and curses, slamming into rails that splintered like dry ribs under the crush, and through the churn of dust and sparks the mountain man ripped free of the post with chains shrieking like souls in hell, his back a lattice of blood and fire, steam writhing off his branded flesh like ghosts clawing for sky, and his jaw locked hard enough to crack stone as he barreled through the first man in his path, slamming him spine first into the trough so hard water sheeted crimson in the fire glow. And then his fist drove a jaw sideways in a crunch that sprayed teeth across the grit while the bride dove for cover behind the water cart, her breath sawing hot in her throat as lead hissed past like angry bees, splintering oak staves into jagged mouths, and the sheriff's laugh shredded through the din like barbed wire ripping flesh, his boots thudding heavy as he swung his iron up and roared for the big man to drop or die. But the only thing that dropped was another body when the mountain man wrenched a rifle from a deputy's claws and swung it like a flail. The stock-crunching skull with a wet pop that sprayed gray matter into the fire sparks, and screams tore the wind as men stampeded for the gates, their faces masks of terror now, because they'd seen brands make men howl, but never forge a beast that moved like thunder walking on two legs. And through it all the hawk screamed high above, wheeling black against a sky shredded by firelight, its cry slicing through the smoke like the last judgment, and that sound drove something savage up his spine as he plowed toward the corral, the bride stumbling after through the storm of grit and lead, her hands clawing at the dust to keep low while bullets spat white sparks from the iron pump. And when the sheriff fired again, the slug carved a hot kiss across her sleeve, jerking her sideways into the churn. And the mountain man spun with a roar that ripped raw from his chest, his arm lashing up as the stolen rifle bucked flame, and the blast slammed the lawman back into the branding fire, his coat flaring in a roar that swallowed his scream whole as the smell of burning cloth and flesh rolled greasy over the yard. And men shrieked and scattered like chaff in a gale, while the mountain man caught the bride by the waist and flung her onto a half-mad bronc that reared under the sparks, its eyes rolling white as moons, and he swung up behind, ribs screaming like nails under his hide, blood slicking his fingers as he locked one arm tight around her and ripped the reins into a savage arc. And then they were flying, fire in their wake and hell snapping at their heels, the yard shrinking to a red wound in the black as the hawk's cry tore the sky open like a warning and a promise that this night wasn't done bleeding yet. The forest swallowed them in black silence, save for the ragged drum of hooves and the hiss of blood in the mountain man's ears, his arm locked like iron around the bride as the bronc tore a path through the pines, snow spraying in white knives from its pounding shoes, while sparks of pain chewed his ribs raw with every jolt. And behind them the night spat fire where the sheriff's men fanned through the timberline, their rifles barking flame that split the dark into shards of smoke and gunpowder stink. And the hawk's cry sliced overhead, fierce and thin as a drawn blade, while the wind shook frost from the needles in ghost clouds that flashed like sparks in the moonlight. And the bride clung tight against his chest, her breath tearing hot through her teeth as she felt the thud of his heart like a drum hammered by devils, and then his voice rolled against her ear. Low and jagged as gravel under iron. Hold low, little dove, storm's got teeth tonight. And before her pulse could stutter, the trees burst wide into a hollow ripped raw by wind. The snow churned to a froth of tracks and hoof gouges, and there they were. 5 riders crouched in the silver dusk, guns drawn and eyes burning wolf red as their horses steamed like beasts born of hell, and the lawman at their center grinned cold as a tomb lamp, the moon painting his badge the color of old bone as he called Jonah's name like a curse dragged over rust, and the weight of it slammed hard into the mountain man's spine because that name was a ghost he'd buried under blood and ash 10 winters gone. But ghosts don't rot, they ride. And now the sheriff was grinning wider, shouting that no iron brand burns hotter than vengeance. And the outlaw with the scar Jonah carved across his jaw all those years back wheeled his bay out of the ranks, his laugh crawling over the wind like barbed wire, and his voice rolled thick with hate as he spat that the mountains couldn't hide a man whose sins wore boots, that the bride's skin would pay for the scar on his face before the night froze, and then his colt snarled fire, the slug singing past Jonah's jaw to smash a chunk of pine into splinters as the bronc screamed and reared under the slap of lead, and Jonah slammed the reins, dragging the beast hard into the shelter of a wind-felled log, while the bride clutched at his coat, her fingers slick with his blood where it leaked slow from the raw meat under his ribs, and his breath tore out in a rasp, thick as iron filings, as he thumbed back the hammer on his colt and hissed through teeth gritted like rock, "Stay down, dove! 'Cause the storm ain't through howling yet." And then the world blew open in a roar of lead as fire spat from the tree line, orange tongues licking the frost-black dark, while the hawk screamed high above like the soul of the peaks crying judgment. And Jonah's heart slammed once, hard as a branding hammer, because he knew this ridge would drink blood before it saw another dawn. The ridge blazed with gunfire that split the night into shards of orange and shadow, muzzle flashes ripping the dark like lightning clawing through storm clouds as Jonah rolled hard into the cover of a boulder, grit biting his palms, while lead sang hot past his ear and punched the pine behind him into splinters, and the bride's breath hissed sharp against his ribs where she lay curled small as a fawn. Her fingers clawed in his coat while blood seeped slow and sticky down his flank. Each pulse a hammer pounding iron into his skull, and above them the hawk screamed high, its cry slicing the smoke-thick sky like a blade from heaven, a sound that made his teeth lock, because if the peaks were watching, then judgment had come down in fire and blood, and the sheriff's voice rolled through the trees like a curse dragged on a rusted chain, barking that the girl wasn't worth the hide on Jonah's back, that if he'd crawl out now they might leave her breathing, and the laugh that followed crawled cold into Jonah's bones because mercy in that mouth was just another name for the noose, and his jaw clenched till it cracked as he rasped low against the bride's hair, telling her to hold tight, hold low, 'cause the storm's just breaking, and then he slid out slow, boots grinding frost, the colt heavy as doom in his fist as his shadow bled long over snow that gleamed like steel, and his eyes burned black through the powder smoke while shapes prowled between the trees, wolves in broad hats, rifles twitching like hungry tongues, and the scarred outlaw with the grin that still stank of 10 winters' hate stepped forward through the torch glow, his breath smoking like hell's own fog as he spat that this was where the mountains swallow ghosts, and his pistol gleamed like a fang before it snarled fire, the blast slamming heat past Jonah's cheek as he dove sideways into the drift, his shot barking back and catching a deputy square in the throat, red steaming from the hole like a brand kissed by snow, and then the whole ridge went mad, guns coughing flame, branches spitting splinters into the night while horses screamed and tore their hobbles loose, their iron shoes clanging sparks from stone as they plunged wild through the trees, and Jonah's lungs scorched with smoke as he dragged the bride to a wind-scoured ledge where the timber broke off sharp into black, and his breath sawed hard as he shoved her behind a slab of granite and spun back to face the fire, teeth bared, shoulders squared like a wall of meat and iron, while his voice ripped raw across the roar, telling the lawman and every devil riding with him that this ridge was their gallows, and he was the rope. And the hawk stooped low then, its wings scything sparks from the torchlight, and the outlaw's laugh cracked through the blaze as he roared for his men to burn the hollow clean. And Jonah felt the heat flare red on his face as the torches came sailing through the smoke, and the ridge lit like the mouth of hell yawning wide to swallow them all. The fire rolled over the ridge like a living beast, chewing black holes through the timber as sparks swarmed thick as hornets, and smoke boiled skyward in greasy columns that stank of pitch and blood, and Jonah tore through the orange glare with the bride locked under his arm, his lungs scalded raw, boots hammering shale that slipped underfoot like oiled glass, and behind him the sheriff's pack came roaring through the smoke, their rifles snarling fire as torches swung like flaming axes, hurling shadows that writhed and lunged against the cliff face, and the hawk's cry slashed high above, shrill and savage as a war hymn while the wind screamed through the splintered crowns, whipping the blaze into a red tide that licked across the snow like tongues of hell, and through that furnace roar rose a sound that didn't belong, a long, low howl rolling from the black timber beyond the flames. Followed by another and another, until the dark thrummed with a chorus of teeth and hunger, and the sheriff's men faltered, curses choking in their throats as shapes boiled out of the smoke, lean gray ghosts with eyes burning cold as steel, wolves bounding low through the fire glow, their hackles spitting sparks as they fanned in a half-moon, hemming man and beast alike in a ring of death, and Jonah spun, his ribs screaming like bent nails, his colt heavy and slick in his fist as he hissed at the bride to stay flat in the hollow and not breathe a prayer, because if the peaks were listening tonight, they weren't sending angels. They'd sent these, raw-boned and ragged, their jaws wet with the lawman's fear, and the sheriff bellowed for his men to burn them down, his voice cracking like old timber as rifles kicked thunder and lead ripped the dark into shards. Slugs whining off rock and punching wolves into the dirt where they writhed like whips. But the pack came on, leaping through fire with a fury that stank of smoke and blood, and Jonah used that storm like a blade, breaking left through the whirl of teeth and lead, his breath tearing like wind over scree, as he dragged the bride toward a knife edge of stone where the firelight bled thin, and his voice rasped hard in her ear that the ridge runs to a gulch that cuts clean to the river. But the law would ride their backs till they drowned in their own blood unless he cracked the spine of this pack hunt now. And she clutched his arm with fingers stiff as ice, her sob drowned under the roar as a bullet kissed the rock by her skull and spat chips that stung like wasps, and Jonah wheeled, his colt barking 3 times in fire-bright arcs that dropped 2 men screaming into the flame-scoured snow, their hats spinning like black leaves in the wind while the hawk screamed again and stooped low, its wings cleaving smoke in a flash of iron, and Jonah's teeth bared in a grin cold as death as he ripped the last shell into the colt and told the lawman loud enough to cut the storm that when dawn hit this ridge, there'd be 1 less badge to blind the sun. And the words hit the night like sparks on dry bone, setting the world ablaze with a promise carved in lead. The ridge burned like a scar under the moon, fire chewing black holes through the timber as smoke dragged bitter ghosts across the stars, and Jonah moved through that furnace light with death humming in his bones, his colt heavy as a gravestone in his fist, his breath grinding out in rasps that tasted of blood and iron, and then the sheriff's roar split the blaze, raw and jagged, hauling Jonah's eyes to the jag of rock where the lawman stood with the bride locked in his fist, her skirts torn and scorched, her throat arched under the gleam of a knife that licked firelight like a snake's tongue, and the sight ripped something loose in Jonah's chest, something black and hot as the coals still hissing in the branding pit, and the sheriff grinned wide through the smoke, his teeth glowing corpse white as he spat that a man who steals the law's prize earns his mark twice. And this time it burns on the heart, and Jonah felt the words rake across his ribs like spurs because he knew what was coming, knew it when the sheriff jerked his head toward the iron laid glowing on a slab of stone, the same serpent that had kissed Jonah's flesh now hungry for the bride's, and his voice cracked the dark like a coffin lid slamming as he said the deal was ash. The rope's off the table, this ends with fire or lead, and Jonah's jaw locked hard enough to split as he stepped slow into the torch glow, boots grinding embers that spat sparks into the smoke, while the hawk screamed high, circling like a black scythe against the burning sky, and every man still breathing dragged back into a ring wide as a gallows, their rifles glinting like cold teeth in the flare, as the sheriff's thumb hooked his hammer and hissed through a grin that the mountain made his bid, now pay it in blood. And in that breath the world shrank to the span between their eyes, 2 wolves crouched over a kill, and then the dark blew apart in fire. Jonah's colt, bucking thunder, the sheriff's shot snarling back as lead hissed through the smoke and ripped sparks from the stone, and the bride hit the grit rolling. Her scream drowned in the roar as Jonah dove low, his ribs screaming molten iron while his slug punched the sheriff's shoulder in a spray of meat and cloth, spinning him sideways into the slab where the brand hissed like a devil's laugh. And before his curse ripped clear, Jonah was on him, iron fingers clamping his wrist and slamming his skull against the rock till blood sheeted the stone black, and the knife clanged free, spitting sparks as it skittered into the dark, and Jonah's breath roared in his ears as he drove the sheriff down, his knee grinding the man's spine while his fist came up clutching the iron still spitting steam, and his voice rumbled low as thunder crawling over bones when he bent close and rasped against the sheriff's blood-wet ear. "Here's your law. Brand it deep." And the iron dropped with a hiss that split the night like a scream dragged over steel, the stink of burning flesh rolling thick as hell's own breath, while the sheriff's howl tore the black wide open, and the hawk's cry ripped through it like judgment come down in wings of fire. Dawn crawled over the ridge slow and cold, bleeding pale gold through a sky gutted by smoke as the wind dragged ragged ghosts of fire through the black timber stumps, and the ground lay butchered in frost and blood, the prints of boots and wolves punched deep into the ash like scars that would never heal. And Jonah stood in the hush with the weight of the iron still smoking in his fist, its glow dead now but the stink of burned flesh clinging thick as sin in his beard, and at his boots sprawled the sheriff, face half melted in its own scream, the badge warped into his chest like a brand from hell's forge, and around them the law's dogs lay quiet as felled pines, rifles cold in dead hands, their blood steaming faint against the frost as the fire in the gorge hissed its last breath, and the hawk wheeled high overhead, its cry slicing the newborn light like the voice of the peaks calling the reckoning tallied and done. And Jonah lifted his eyes to that wild arc and felt the burn in his ribs, felt the ghost weight of chains dragging across his skin where the brands still smoked raw. But under the pain, there pulsed something fierce and bright, something hammered in lead and sealed in blood, the vow he'd spoken when he tore her loose from that post. She walks free, or the world burns to the roots, and the world had burned. And she was free now, standing in the glow of first sun with her hair torn wild, and her face streaked with soot and tears, her eyes black and bottomless as a midnight lake as they locked on his. And for a long breath nothing moved. Nothing spoke but the wind combing through the wreckage, and then she crossed to him slow, her bare feet whispering over the ash as her hands, small and shaking, lifted to his chest where the brand lay ugly and red, and her touch was soft as thawed snow, yet it scalded deeper than the iron, and her voice broke like a dry twig when she whispered why, and Jonah looked at her with eyes gone dark as the gorge and said low, "Because no man's worth less than a saddle, not while I've got blood to trade," and the words crawled into her bones like fire chasing frost, and her tears spilled fast then, cutting clean tracks through the soot on her cheeks as she folded against him, her sobs small and fierce under the drum of his heart, and he wrapped her tight in arms that shook like timber in a gale, holding her as if the world might split again, and maybe it would, but not now. Not in this hush where the smoke thinned to ribbons and the sun climbed gold through the ragged crowns, gilding the hawk's wings as it rode the wind high and proud, its cry scything the cold like a vow written on sky, and Jonah bent his head into her hair, breathing deep, tasting salt and ash and something wild as hope, and he knew the trail ahead would be carved in blood and iron, but it would be theirs, hammered straight through the bones of the frontier till the day the peaks crumbled and the wind forgot his name.